The phone buzzed insistently in my pocket, cutting through the heat of the midday sun. I stepped outside the makeshift clinic where I'd spent the past few weeks volunteering, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. My gut clenched when I saw the name flashing on the screen. Richard. I almost didn't answer. After years of living under my stepfather's manipulation, I'd learned that calls from him rarely meant anything good. But curiosity, and maybe some small flicker of hope, got the better of me. "Hello," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. "Catherine?" His voice rang out, overly cheerful in a way that instantly made my stomach turn. "Just wanted to let you know, I sold the cabin." I froze, gripping the phone tighter. "You did what?" "Sold it," he repeated casually, like he was talking about unloading an old couch. "You should thank me, really. It's for the greater good, my greater good, mostly," he added with a smug laugh that made my blood boil. "My name is Catherine, and for as long as I can remember, Richard has been the thorn in my side. My mom married him when I was 15, and for a while I thought he was just another charming stepdad trying too hard. But beneath the charm was a man who saw everything, and everyone, as a tool for his own benefit, including me. The cabin wasn't just some vacation property to me, it was my sanctuary, the one place that was fully mine. I'd spent years restoring it with my best friend Laura, turning it into a retreat where I could breathe after brutal work weeks and escape the noise of the world. It was my refuge when my mother passed, the place where I'd grieved and healed. And now Richard had sold it like it was nothing more than a chip to cash in for his own bad decisions. "You had no right," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. "That cabin wasn't yours to sell." "Relax," he drawled as if I were being ridiculous. "It was just sitting there empty half the time. You're always off saving the world, so why not put it to good use? Easy way to settle some debts. You'll thank me once you cool off." "I'll thank you when hell freezes over," I said, slamming the call down before he could say another word. I stood there for a moment, my hand still clutching the phone, my pulse pounding in my ears. This was Richard in his truest form, smiling to your face while stabbing you in the back, all with the confidence that you'd just roll over and take it. Not this time. Because what Richard didn't know, and what I wasn't about to tell him, was that the cabin wasn't entirely mine. Laura, my best friend since college, was my co-owner, and the legal agreement we signed years ago required both our signatures to sell the property. Whatever shady deal Richard thought he'd made was about to unravel spectacularly. I sat on the edge of my cot, the afternoon heat pressing down on me like a weight. My mind spun, replaying Richard's smug voice, the way he always made himself the center of every decision. But this time, he'd crossed a line he couldn't walk back from. I hit Laura's contact and pressed call. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and familiar. "Hey Kathy, how's the clinic?" "Richard sold the cabin," I said, cutting straight to the point. There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Excuse me, what?" "Apparently he needed quick cash to settle some gambling debts, but the idiot forgot you're on the deed. He can't sell it without your consent." "Oh my God," Laura said, her voice switching from shock to disgust. "That man has the morals of a sewer rat." "Understatement of the year," I muttered. "Can you dig up the documents? I want to have everything ready when I get back." "Already on it," she promised. "We'll shut this down." As I hung up, I felt the storm inside me settle into something cold and sharp. Richard thought he'd gotten away with it, that I was too far away, too wrapped up in work to fight back. What he forgot was that I wasn't the quiet teenager who used to shrink whenever he raised his voice. I was an adult now, one with resources, allies, and no patience left for his nonsense. The next few days blurred together as I wrapped up my assignment at the clinic, But no matter how busy I kept, Richard's voice played on a loop in my head. His arrogance, his entitlement, the sheer gall of thinking he could sell my refuge without consequence. It was enough to keep me awake at night, burning with equal parts rage and resolve. Late one night, after my last round of patient visits, I sat down with my journal, something I always brought with me when I travelled. Writing had always been my anchor, and now I needed it to channel the storm inside me. I wrote about the first summer I spent at the cabin, roasting marshmallows with my mum and chasing fireflies through the woods. I wrote about the weekends Laura and I spent sanding floors, painting walls, and building shelves until the cabin felt like an extension of ourselves. I wrote about the quiet nights after my mum passed, when the only thing keeping me sane was sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the stars. This wasn't just a cabin. It was the last piece of my childhood, the one place where I didn't have to be anyone's saviour or anyone's crutch. Richard thought he could take that from me like he'd taken everything else, but this time he'd made a fatal mistake. He'd underestimated just how much fight I had left in me. Laura called again the next morning, her voice brisk and businesslike. "Found the paperwork," she said. "He can't sell a damn thing without both our signatures. There's no legal sale. The contract's void." Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a grim satisfaction. "Do we know who he sold it to?" "Not yet," she said. "I checked the county records. There's no official transfer filed. He might have tried some off-the-books handshake deal." That sounded exactly like Richard, always looking for a shortcut, always thinking rules were for other people. "What's our next move?" I asked. "We have options," Laura said. "We can either confront him directly, or we can let the lawyer handle it. Either way, he's screwed." "Let's make sure he knows it," I said, the steel in my voice surprising even me. As I ended the call, the plan came into focus. I'd finish my work here, fly home, and face Richard on my own terms. No screaming, no crying, that's what he expected. No, I was going to dismantle him piece by piece, using the only weapon he never saw coming, my ability to prepare. He thought he'd won. He thought I'd be too far away, too soft-hearted, too compliant to stop him. He was about to find out exactly how wrong he was. When I finally arrived home, the silence felt heavier than usual. The cabin always welcomed me with a quiet sense of peace, the kind of stillness that let me breathe. But this time, that silence felt off. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, the kind that hums with the knowledge that something is about to break. My houseplants drooped slightly from neglect. A pile of unopened mail leaned against the door, and the fridge was almost bare. I set my bags down and exhaled slowly, the weight of what needed to be done settling fully on my shoulders. There was no time to unpack, not yet. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Richard. Of course, I stared at the screen, debating whether to let it ring out, but no, hiding had never been my style. Time to deal with this head-on. "Well, if it isn't my world-travelling stepdaughter," Richard's voice oozed fake charm, the kind I'd fallen for as a teenager and grown to resent as an adult. "Finally back to the real world, huh?" "What do you want, Richard?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. "Just checking in," he said, his smile audible through the phone. "Wanted to make sure you weren't too upset about the whole cabin situation. No point crying over spilled milk, right? It's done." My grip tightened around the phone. "Funny you should say that," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Because Laura and I checked the ownership records. The sale didn't go through. You can't sell what doesn't belong to you." There was a beat of silence, just long enough to confirm I'd caught him off guard. "That's ridiculous," Richard blustered, the cheer disappearing from his tone. "The buyer paid in cash. Everything's handled. It's a done deal." "No, Richard," I said, my voice like steel. It's not. Laura and I co-own the cabin. Without her signature, the sale is invalid. It's still ours. The brittle laugh that followed sounded more nervous than amused. You think you're so smart, don't you? Always the perfect daughter, always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. His voice turned bitter. You have no idea how hard things have been for me. I did what I had to do. You stole from me, I said, my composure barely intact. You've made your choices, Richard. Now you'll deal with the consequences. He hung up without another word. I stood there for a moment, my phone still in my hand, my heart pounding. For years, Richard had manipulated situations to his advantage. Guilt-tripping, gaslighting, using his bad luck and bad choices as an excuse to leech off everyone around him. But not this time. This wasn't just about a property dispute. This was me reclaiming something much bigger. My boundaries, my voice, and the peace of mind Richard had stolen from me bit by bit. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, Laura's emails open in front of me. The co-ownership agreement was ironclad. Neither of us could sell, transfer, or lease the cabin without both signatures. Richard's attempted sale wasn't just shady, it was illegal. A sharp knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I wasn't surprised when I opened it to find Richard standing there, looking smug despite the circumstances. Mind if I come in? He asked, already stepping over the threshold without waiting for an answer. I folded my arms, watching as he made himself at home in my chair, the same chair I'd sanded and stained with my own hands. What do you want, Richard? I asked, my voice flat. Look, he began, his tone full of that familiar, slimy condescension. I know you're upset, but you need to see things from my side. I was desperate. The people I owed money to, they aren't the type to wait around. I raised a brow, unimpressed. So your solution was to sell something that doesn't belong to you? Borrowing, he corrected, waving his hand like that changed anything. It was temporary. Once my luck turned around, I would have paid you back every penny. The sheer delusion would have been comical if it weren't so infuriating. Your luck? I let out a hollow laugh. Richard, you've been gambling away money for over a decade. What's going to be different this time? He squirmed slightly, then recovered, leaning back with fake ease. You're overreacting. It's just a cabin, Catherine. You're barely ever there. What's the harm in letting someone else put it to better use? Because, I said, stepping closer, my voice low and unshakable, it's mine. It's Laura's. It's not yours, and it never was. You don't get to decide what I value or what I do with my home. For the first time, the mask slipped. There, beneath the smarmy arrogance, was something almost like fear. You wouldn't really go to the authorities, he said, though the crack in his voice betrayed him. You wouldn't ruin your own stepfather. I leaned in, close enough that he couldn't avoid my eyes. Try me. He stood abruptly, muttering under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the window panes. My hands were shaking, from adrenaline, from anger, from sheer relief. The confrontation had left me exhausted but also lighter. Richard was starting to realize that I wasn't the same person he'd spent years manipulating. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who had pushed me around for far too long. I called Laura the moment he was gone. He showed up at my door, I said, pacing my living room. Tried to spin it into some sob story about how he was just borrowing the cabin. Laura snorted. Borrowing? Does that line actually work on anyone? Apparently not anymore, I said. I told him the sale was invalid, and that if he pushed me, I'd involve the authorities. It shook him a bit, but I doubt it'll stop him from trying something else. Let him try, Laura said, her tone all business. I've already contacted a lawyer. We're drafting a formal cease and desist letter. If Richard tries to involve the buyer again, we'll have a documented paper trail showing the sale was fraudulent from the start. I felt my breath come easier. With Laura's backup and the law on our side, Richard was running out of moves. "He's desperate," I said. "That makes him unpredictable." "Desperate people are sloppy," Laura replied. "He's going to trip over his own lies." "Not if I get to him first," I said softly. The words came out before I even realized I meant them. I wasn't just defending my property anymore. I was taking back every piece of myself that Richard had tried to claim. My space, my confidence, my voice. This time, I wasn't going to wait for Richard to push me into a corner. I was going to end this on my terms. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" Laura asked. "Oh yeah," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "It's time Richard realized the game's over." I nodded, Laura's words grounding me. "Thanks, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," she said with a smile, "but we're in this together." Over the next few days, I threw myself into preparation. I gathered every document, screenshot, and message that could help build my case. The co-ownership agreement was scanned and saved in multiple places, and I even tracked down the real estate agent Richard had used to try and pull off his fraudulent sale. The agent's voice was tight with nerves when I called her. "Look, I didn't know the full situation," she said quickly. "Richard told me he had full authority to sell. If I'd known there was another owner, I never would have touched the deal." "Now you know," I said evenly, though I could feel my pulse racing. "I'm not looking to cause trouble for you, but I do need confirmation. Did Richard sign everything himself?" "Yes," she admitted after a pause. "The buyer hasn't even paid in full yet because I flagged the transaction as unusual. If you need copies of the documents, I'm happy to provide them." "That would be helpful," I said, jotting down her contact information. When I hung up, a cold sense of satisfaction settled over me. Richard thought I was too far away, too uninvolved to catch him. He thought I'd stay quiet like I always used to. He had no idea the woman he was dealing with wasn't the same girl he steamrolled for years. That evening, Laura called with another update. "The letter's ready," she said. "We'll send it out tomorrow. If he so much as breathes in the direction of that buyer again, we escalate." "Perfect," I said, the words tasting sweeter than I expected. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground solid beneath me. Richard had always relied on me staying quiet. He was about to see just how loud I could get. The next morning, Laura and I reviewed the final cease and desist letter one last time. It was sharp and clear. Any further attempts to interfere with the cabin or contact the buyer would trigger immediate legal action. I imagined the look on Richard's face when he opened it, probably half outrage, half disbelief. For years he'd leaned on manipulation and intimidation to get his way. This time, those tactics would fail. Later that afternoon, the real estate agent followed through and sent me the paperwork. Seeing Richard's bold, sloppy signature on a contract he had no right to sign turned my stomach. But more than disgust, I felt resolve. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about principle, about standing my ground in ways I should have done years ago. That evening, Detective Miller called. Laura had reached out to him, and now he was fully briefed. "Miss Daniels?" His voice was calm, professional. "I've reviewed the documents you and Miss Langley provided. It's clear this was an unauthorized attempt to transfer property. Based on your evidence, we can move forward with an official investigation if you're ready." "I'm ready," I said without hesitation. "Next step is contacting the buyer," he continued, "and making sure they understand the transaction is void. If Richard persists, we'll pursue fraud charges." "Thank you," I said. As I hung up, the sense of control I'd fought for, settled deep in my chest. The wheels were turning now and Richard couldn't stop them. The next day, Richard called. His voice was sharp with anger, but I could hear something else beneath it, fear. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Catherine?" he spat. "You're ruining everything." "No, Richard," I said calmly. "I'm protecting what's mine. You did this to yourself." "You've always been so ungrateful," he sneered, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. "After everything I've done for this family, you think you're better than me now?" I laughed softly, but there was nothing funny about it. "You didn't do anything for this family, Richard. You did things for yourself, and you made sure everyone else paid for it. This isn't about the cabin. This is about you being incapable of taking responsibility for your own failures." He tried to interrupt, but I didn't let him. "This conversation is over. If you have anything to say, you can direct it to my lawyer." I hung up without waiting for his reply. 2 days later, Detective Miller followed up. "Miss Daniels, the buyers agreed to void the sale. They were unaware of the co-ownership agreement and are fully cooperating." Relief bloomed in my chest. "So, it's official? The sale's dead?" "Yes," he confirmed. "The cabin remains in your and Miss Langley's names. However, we'll be pursuing Richard for fraudulent misrepresentation. Would you like to formally press charges?" I paused, but only for a moment. "Yes," I said firmly. "He needs to be held accountable." "Understood," the detective said. "We'll begin that process immediately." After the call, I just sat in silence for a moment, letting it sink in. It was over. The cabin was safe. Richard's house of lies was crumbling, and I had done this. Me. Later that day, I called Laura. "It's done," I said. "The sale is void and the cabin's ours. Richard's officially under investigation." "Hell yes!" Laura cheered. "He finally ran into a wall he couldn't bulldoze through." We celebrated that night with wine on the cabin's porch, watching the sky melt into deep purples and golds. The air was crisp, the kind of perfect mountain evening I'd always cherished. For the first time, I could sit there without Richard's shadow looming in the back of my mind. "You know," Laura said, her voice soft, "this isn't just a win for the cabin. This is a win for you." "How do you mean?" She swirled her wine. "For years you let him push you around, but this time you stood your ground. You fought back. That's not just a victory for the property. That's you proving to yourself that you don't have to live your life under anyone else's rules." Her words stayed with me long after the wine was gone and Laura had left. Alone in the cabin, the fire crackling softly, I let the weight of everything wash over me. Richard had tried to take something precious from me, and not just land. He tried to steal my confidence, my security, my belief in my own power, but he failed. The next week, Detective Miller called with the final update. "Miss Daniels, Richard has officially been charged with attempted fraudulent transfer of property and misrepresentation. He's been ordered to appear in court. Based on your evidence, the case is strong." Hearing it put so plainly, Richard is being held accountable, filled me with a strange sense of closure. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." "You stood up to him," the detective replied. "That's no small thing." After the call, I stood on the cabin porch, watching the trees sway in the breeze. The air smelled of pine and earth, the same way it always had when I was a kid, only now it felt truly mine. Over the next few weekends, Laura and I made the cabin our project again. We repainted the deck, planted wildflowers, and repaired the broken railing Richard had ignored for years. Each task felt like reclaiming another piece of my life, not just the property, but my sense of safety, my right to my own boundaries. "Where do you go from here?" Laura asked one night, both of us sipping cocoa under the stars. I thought about it, really thought about it, and smiled. I go wherever I want, I said simply, because I finally can. She raised her mug. To that, I echoed. The next morning I stood alone on the porch, the sunrise bathing the cabin in soft gold. This was my home, my safe place, and no one would ever take it from me again. I wasn't just reclaiming a cabin, I was reclaiming myself.